Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Just to introduce myself, I'm Dorcas from Singapore. You heard from one of my former colleagues earlier on, Judge Tian Yizi. So I'm teaching in a law school in Singapore, focusing on dispute resolution. Have been in the area of dispute resolution for about 25 years or so. So I actually used to work in the courts as a district judge, and then 10 years ago I left and then I went to academia. Let me just get rid of this funny key. Oh,
Yep. This one. Say skip
right.
and see.
Thanks. Yeah, so I would just like to share in terms of we talk about remote mediation. So I'm continuing in the same vein today, but talking not so much about merely mediation, but we're looking at I'm sharing a project I did where I got through an experiment people to negotiate using 4 different communication modes, including Zoom. And so where this might relate to what we're talking about today, notice I'm talking not so much about AI, but I'm going to further back to an issue which I feel has not been fully resolved, at least in my mind, in the ODR field. And before it was resolved, we swiftly moved into the AI, into the use of generative AI, which is so widespread. So if you're interested in reading the article, I'm just summarizing the very high level findings. This is an article which I co-wrote with someone, and it can be downloaded. I believe is in the Google Drive for this forum. And just want to share something in terms of why look at this area, right? When we're looking at ODR or technology, so we can probably remember yesterday I well recall that Ethan, Mac's documentary about Ethan, he did mention that Ethan mentions this quote, the medium is the message. So that is a quotation taken from Marshall McLuhan back in 1964. And I think it was something that Ethan it struck a chord with him. So back when the internet became more of a rage, so that was actually trying to explain that the medium, whatever mode that we use, actually can shape. Especially if it's scaled up, right? Where if everyone using the internet, it can actually have personal and social consequences, right? Which I think we can see, right? If everyone is using the medium, and Beth talked about, whether it leads to more democratization of views or whether it's the converse. So in 1985, this is another quote. This is from this book from Neil Postman, entitled "Amusing Ourselves to Death: Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business." You can see what's on their heads, TV screens. So of course, you can guess he's talking about how TV has affected the public discourse. This is back in the 1980s when TV perhaps was not as ubiquitous as now. But why I want to quote this is I thought what is salient is that he highlights that instead of the medium is the message, which was a previous quote, he developed further to say the medium is the metaphor, which he's going not so much the sense that it might influence human behavior, but it actually is a unique mode of discourse depending on what medium we use. So it can actually affect our interaction. It can shape how we actually make sense of the content and the truth that we talk about. So I think this is quite important because it does bring to fore this issue about, even though we have been using for ages, according to the ODR community, we have used technology, we have used Zoom, we have used Teams, WhatsApp. Have we actually examined how these particular mediums, especially they are used as part of the ODR system, how do they affect the discourse between people? And the reason why I want to look at this is that it was just a curious thought I had in my mind because I'm a mediator. And people would tell me, hey, you shouldn't use this, or you should do this, you should use Zoom this way. And I thought, why not just investigate? I also wanted to investigate because I think since COVID, usage, behaviors, patterns, and what we're used to would have changed. I also looked at the literature, the research across various disciplines, whether business, communication, conflict resolution. It hasn't actually been a settled question, the impact of the medium. So for all those reasons, this is why I wanted to investigate this question about the impact of the communication mode, which I shall explain which modes, on negotiation behavior. So here I'm looking at negotiation, that means one-on-one negotiation. I would like to share with you so that we can bring this home and make this real. This anecdote is not about ODR, but it's just a very everyday situation of people using instant messaging like Microsoft Teams at work, at your office. It's actually a partially true anecdote. I got the permission to share it. So this is what happened. Angeline only meant to send a quick reminder while on her computer. As a supervisor in the company, she messaged Bob on Microsoft Teams. Okay, she did it on a laptop, about an approaching deadline. Bob messaged back that I need more time, insisting that the deadline could not be met. She typed her reply, retyped, deleted, and then as she typed more and more back and forth, she felt her irritation rising. So she eventually stopped responding. Maybe some of us like to do that, just ghost a person. It can be resolved. 5 minutes later, lo and behold, Bob walked past Angelina's office without a greeting or a glance. Angelina wondered why he did not simply just step into her office and speak to her about what happened in their last conversation. So this is something maybe for us to think about. It does describe a little bit of what I showed earlier about the medium. Do you think it affects a certain behavior? Do you think there's a certain frame or metaphor which actually does have an impact on the negotiation behavior, their responses to each other, especially when it involves a relationship like co-workers? Which then brings home the point that, so communication media, not just at workplaces, right? But if we now look at a different context in this forum, like ODR forum, we well know that communication media is embedded within every stage of ODR system, like there are building blocks, various stages. And there's always a design choice, which medium you want to embed. Say when you first come in negotiation, how are you going to negotiate? And you go further to mediation, who's going to mediate or what mode are you going to mediate? And in this respect, I just want to acknowledge this Jennifer. Yes, Jennifer, because the RSI and the work has really been helpful to me. So I just want to acknowledge that. I've got this from the toolkit for RSI on making sense of ODR to the public. But it just illustrates one of the recommended wording to introduce ODR. It actually explains what's going to happen, right? And it says that in ODR, you can try to settle your case by exchanging messages online with the plaintiff, right? So I'm actually focusing on that particular process when people are exchanging messages in the context of a dispute. And so it's negotiation. There's no third party neutral at this stage, right? So there were two questions I had, broad questions in this empirical research. First, of course, is there so-called a best medium for negotiation, which I doubted there was one. But anyway, the question was the 4 modes would be face-to-face interaction. Video was Zoom video, which we are familiar with. Audio, interestingly, is not a phone call, but I got participants to use Zoom, but you switch off your webcam, which is quite common. I mean, we do that, at least in my context. A lot of people do that when they're meetings, they switch off their webcam, and all you can hear is your voice, and you see a blank screen on Zoom. And then the other will be text messaging. I say synchronous text because due to experimental conditions, we had to have some similarities because we gave 1 hour to everyone. So although text is normally done asynchronously, so in this situation, we had it done synchronously. That means we said, you have 1 hour and then you go and do your negotiation via text. Text was done by your WhatsApp, and it was not the phone because everyone was using laptops, so we used WhatsApp web So similar to what you would have in a workplace when you type on Microsoft Teams and you're doing instant messaging. So that's the first question. And as I mentioned, these are reasons why I was engaging in this question. Second question, which I was actually much more interested in, is because in my time teaching negotiation, I realized, or I suspected, the first question is not it's just a straightforward answer. And I observed that different people tend to use different modes in different ways. So maybe like it might text or might work for the person, sometimes it might not. So I had the suspicion that perhaps this question one, might depend a lot on the individual negotiator characteristics. Characteristics such as personality traits like extroversion, agreeableness, big five, or even the extent to which you are direct or indirect in your communication style. So this was the one actually I was quite interested and more interested in. And this was actually it was a research done in Singapore. So just in terms of the methodology, I'll go through very quickly. But because you have 4 modes, we required 50 dyads for each of the 4 modes, which translated to 200 pairs or dyads or 400 participants. So they are all from Singapore universities. So we selected people without any prior ADR or negotiation experience. And they were all, so it was in a sense, although they could do it remotely, for consistency, we got everyone to come to certain rooms. And then if they had to negotiate via text, for instance, they'll go to separate rooms and they'll be supplied their equipment to do it. So I tried to actually look at negotiation outcomes in a holistic manner. So you see both non-economic measures as well as economic measures, because I was interested in measuring success of negotiation, not merely by settlement rate, whether you reach an agreement, but really your sense of, I actually had procedural justice, but I didn't mention that. But you look at non-economic measures, you have things like rapport, trust levels, future willingness to negotiate. And then the impact on negotiator traits, I looked at big 5 personality traits. I looked at an instrument that measures the degree to which you are indirect in your communication style. Also the Thomas Kuhlman Index in terms of your default conflict management style. So these are the key findings, and just like to share a few of them. And of course, bear in mind, these are respondents in Asia, right, in Singapore. I also want to do this because we seldom have such empirical research for Asian participants. And we have, just anecdotally, I think there are quite different defaults in terms of conflict management style and communication style as well in Singapore. So what we found was, not sure whether it's a surprise, but text negotiations performed the worst compared to the other 3 modes, audio, video, and face-to-face. And these were significantly differences, significant statistically, and also across a wide range of outcomes, not just economic outcomes, but also relational outcomes. There were some surprising findings about audio negotiation. So if you recall, this is like a Zoom, and then you switch off your camera. Some surprisingly positive outcomes, even though it's supposedly a lean medium. And then the one that I find most fascinating, that there were several negotiator traits that actually affected how these media affected negotiation. And I'll be doing some further research on that. This just came out. I just wrote about the first finding about texting, and in Singapore Straits Times, but in the context of workplace conversations. And the anecdote which I just shared with you, Angelina and Bob, yeah, so this is about that kind of situation. How should you communicate? So just to underscore, the main finding here was that they took twice as long. So they all given out to 1 hour. They took almost the entire hour, and not all reached agreement despite taking almost a whole hour. And I think they were the only mode out of the 4, because we also look at their emotions post-negotiation. The only mode where there was anger, that means the strongest emotion. And it was that anger was not in the the other modes, we look at the outcomes in terms of the value. So there actually is a scoring schedule. So if you actually add their scores for each person, that became notionally what we call the value creation, right? At their total cumulative score. Yeah, it wasn't that great either when you look at what they got. So this is where, shout out again to Jennifer. I think this is where it's relevant because I find this particular report, which actually expanded on the focus group's perspectives on text-based ODR. I like some of these sound bites because I think they express some similar sentiments that came out as to how people might actually view text-based ODR. Just to make it clear, in this case, of course, because it was not a court system, so what I did was, it was a negotiation simulation where you have a dispute between two co-workers. You had 3 issues to be resolved, and you just had to do it through a certain medium. So of course, it might not be direct, translatable, or applicable to all ODR, but I think there are some common themes that come out from there in terms of what is the impact, right? So if we use this, for instance, when you want to get the disputants in ODR to start negotiating, so are we thinking about is it efficient? Efficient not just for them, but also for the whole system. If more time is spent, is it likely to lead to agreement? So yeah, the lowest rates of agreement, 26% of no agreement on any issue, compared to face-to-face, they only have 4%. More importantly, I felt like lower rates of relational outcomes, rapport, the perceived rapport with the other person, the trust levels with the other person, and as I mentioned, there was the only mode where there were negative emotions. And I should, of course, say here that this was synchronous texting. We know most of the benefits of texting, at least in ODR systems, are drawn from the benefit of asynchronous because you can actually take time, right, to consider your responses and control your emotions. Nevertheless, I'm arguing that even in such situations where it can be asynchronous, it's quite common, and research has borne out, at least in instant messaging at workplaces, it is quite common that text is increasingly used in a synchronous way, when both parties are there in real time and they are talking at the same time, right? So that can occur. And then this is the one to give us time for the next presentation. I will wrap up soon. I'd just like to share that, and also here also acknowledge Norm, because I think I learned a lot about media richness by reading his articles. And so I was very curious as to whether you have, media richness, a continuum, right? Audio is just hearing, and then video you have hearing, plus you have the image, and then face-to-face, the richest mode. So, and there were a lot of theories in the past about task media fit, that the more difficult the negotiation is, the richer mode should be employed, which is face-to-face. And I was curious, is this a case after COVID, right? Or even, of course, these are also people of a different generation, I should mention. They're like in their 20s, early 20s. So was it the case that when they did it face-to-face, and most of them, when we asked them before negotiation, if you had this dispute, will you do it face-to-face? They said, yes, face-to-face is the best. Yeah, so despite that, the face-to-face didn't seem to have the significantly more better outcomes compared to video and audio. They were rather comparable in terms of maybe statistical kind of significance. And then Zoom video, this is something that hasn't been investigated much in the research, despite its very widespread use. Also performed more or less similarly comparable to face-to-face and audio many outcomes. This is a surprise because I don't know, honestly, whether this is particular to the respondents here, or whether it might resonate with some of you, in the sense that there were actually very positive outcomes for audio when they didn't see the person's face. In particular, the joint value creation of the dyads was significantly higher than the face-to-face negotiators. Some psychological theories might suggest that sometimes if you don't have the visual cues, like the person's face, sometimes it will actually facilitate better focus on the content of what you're talking about without being distracted. And it does challenge the whole conventional media richness theory, at least in the area of mediation, in the area of negotiation, sorry. And then this is the final slide. There were a few personality traits which did affect rapport and trust across different communication modes, which I won't have time to elaborate, so I won't elaborate on that, including indirect communication style, which I was just chatting with Dwight, is quite common in an Asian context. You're more indirect rather than just being very upfront in what we say. The one that's really interesting, and perhaps is particular to Singapore, is that when both negotiators have mismatched extroversion, one is really extrovert, and the other one in the cave, right, introvert. So when the extrovert was paired with an introvert, if you just look at this rectangle in purple, interestingly that in such situations, what we decided to call mismatched extroversion levels, when they were negotiating face-to-face, they actually had poorer value creation than when they were negotiating by the top one, 8.11, that's audio. So audio actually was high. 7.81 was video. Down there, 6.85 face-to-face. Right, so that was actually, this suggests maybe when there's some clash of extroversion, introversion, maybe the face-to-face, a very real-time rich medium might even accentuate some of your clashes and hinder perhaps joint value creation. In the same vein, conflict management style. So we did the TKI, right? And in the same vein, we found that when both negotiators interacting with each other are assertive or competitive, right? There are 5 different styles. So when you have this combination, once again, if you look at 6.39, that is face-to-face. So they also had lower value creation jointly compared to 8.12, 8.20 was video and audio. So again, that was something interesting which I might be exploring in another article. So I'm arguing, and I'm curious to hear your views also when later in conversations, how you think this might be applicable for ODR design. So although we have been designing it for a long time, and also it's a different context, like the respondents that we have, it's a different society. What does it mean for how we design ODR systems, especially if we're going to embed negotiation early on in the process? When should negotiation transition to maybe third-party facilitation by a mediator or something else, or when should you go even face-to-face? There is encouraging findings that maybe people are getting more used to Zoom and face-to-face. So Zoom doesn't seem to be subordinate to inferior to face-to-face, at least amongst the Singapore respondents. The audio call, I argue in this, remember this Angeline and Bob, I argue in this situation, perhaps she should not have continued, that to and fro conversation. Perhaps I did this calls also not just for ODR, but for in our personal relationships, being more discerning when we switch to another mode, because it might be more conducive for a better conversation, especially for complex matters that they are akin to negotiation. We might need to talk it out by Zoom video or even by a quick 5-minute conversation. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll look forward to conversations with you.